In the minds of the overwhelming majority, the Middle Ages are a dark era of obscurantism and illiteracy, when most of the population, including the high nobility, could neither read nor write, and books were available only to a select few. All this is true, but it's only part of the truth. Think about it yourself. If everything was really that bad, then where did the brilliant Renaissance, with its rapid growth of culture and science, come from? The roots of the Enlightenment should be sought in the numerous Western European universities that began to appear as early as the early Middle Ages. They played a huge role in the history of the Old World because over hundreds of years they produced many great people, statesmen, scientists, philosophers, poets, and writers. In today's episode, I will talk about how students lived and studied in those times when science and academic traditions were just beginning, where they lived, how they rested and entertained themselves, how they earned money for fun and for bread, and how they defended their rights and interests. You will also find out how much education cost at that time, who was admitted to universities, and which sciences were considered the most important. My name is Semyon, and I declare the How Did They Live section open. Let's begin. How European universities appeared. The first universities appeared in Western Europe around the beginning of the 12th century, and they emerged in the largest cities based on cathedral schools. Initially, a university was called a corporation of professors, teachers, and students whose goal was to expand knowledge in a particular discipline. It should be said that Europeans were somewhat late in creating higher educational institutions. Among Muslims, the first universities appeared as early as the 8th century. But throughout the early Middle Ages, Europeans were dividing a vast continent among themselves. Just beginning to build new kingdoms on the ruins of Rome, they had no time for universities at all. During this time, science and education fell into complete decline. The only institution of higher learning in the Christian world could be called the University of Constantinople, which, however, resembled more the philosophical schools of antiquity. It is believed that the first European university was opened in Bologna in 1088. It arose on the site of a school of law, and the impetus for its creation was a sharp conflict between the Vatican and the Holy Roman Empire. Both sides of the conflict needed good lawyers, so they supported the development of education. In northern Italy, in 1175, another Italian university was opened in the city of Modena, but it did not last long. The emergence of the first universities in Italy was not accidental. Here, the memory of ancient Rome, its traditions, and its high culture was still strong, so it was easiest to create a new educational system here. It is no coincidence that it was on the Apennine Peninsula that the great era of the Renaissance would begin several centuries later. However, Italy did not remain the only center of learning in Europe for long. Already in the middle of the 12th century, the Paris Sorbonne began its work. And when all the English were expelled from there for political reasons, the famous British Oxford was opened. Not all medieval universities have survived to this day. For example, the Salerno Medical School, which was famous throughout Europe in the early Middle Ages, eventually declined and was closed. By the 13th century, there were already about 15 universities on the continent. Oxford gained its eternal rival in the form of Cambridge. In France, 2 more higher education institutions were opened in Toulouse and Montpellier. On the Iberian Peninsula, as many as 3 universities began operating in Lisbon, Salamanca, and Madrid. In the 14th century, the process became avalanche-like. During this century, about 25 new universities appeared in the Old World. By the 15th century, no independent European state could do without a university. For example, in the Duchy of Burgundy, there were as many as 2. And by the end of the 15th century, there were 86 universities operating throughout Europe, including Scotland and Scandinavia. Between 1348 and 1513 universities were founded in the Holy Roman Empire, the first of which was the University of Prague. 2 families of university charters emerged, the Northern Parisian and the Southern Bolognese, the first of which clearly predominated. Statutes similar to the Parisian model were adopted in almost all newly founded universities. Kings and emperors granted universities various privileges, but they rarely participated directly in their founding. For example, Charles IV founded the Prague University, and Alfonso X of Seville founded the Seville University. Conflicts in higher education institutions were often resolved at the highest state level. New schools and universities were being established, not only because a particular people suddenly wanted to become a center of scholarship, but also due to ordinary conflicts between teachers and the authorities or their colleagues. An unhappy professor would pack his things, gather his students, and simply move to a large neighboring city. Since universities brought significant income to local budgets, he was usually welcomed there with open arms. Moreover, cities often lured famous professors away from each other by offering them better conditions. By the 14th century, a unified educational space had already emerged in Europe, something that is often discussed today, and universities were connected to each other by hundreds of unbreakable ties. A young man from German Bavaria could study for several years in Prague, then go to Paris, get a diploma there, and afterwards teach at any secondary or higher school in Western Europe. How was the medieval university organized? Usually, a medieval university consisted of 4 faculties: the Faculty of Liberal Arts, Law, Medicine, and Theology. The study of the liberal arts was considered the initial level of education and was the least prestigious. It was much cooler to get a diploma as a doctor or a lawyer, but theology was still considered the top. At the Faculty of Liberal Arts, students were taught 7 disciplines, which were divided into 2 groups: the so-called trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Studying these subjects was thought to help students understand the universe's fundamental harmony. Teaching at universities was conducted exclusively in Latin, which was the single medieval language of science and enlightenment. Medical subjects were divided into natural, unnatural, such as hygiene and dietetics, and unnatural. Medical students studied the works of Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna, and other famous physicians. After 4 years, they received a bachelor's degree, after which they spent another 2 years practicing medicine under the supervision of a master. Then they were allowed to take the exam for the title of licentiate, a teacher already permitted to give lectures but who had not yet defended a doctoral dissertation. At the law faculty, students were taught both Catholic and Roman law. The course lasted 4 years, after which the student received a bachelor's degree. To become a licentiate, one had to study for another 3 years. Future theologians studied the Holy Scriptures, the works of church authorities, philosophy, and scholasticism. The education lasted about 12 years, after which the graduate received a master's degree and the right to hold high church positions. The awarding of academic degrees was carried out by the Corporation of Teachers. The head of the university was the rector, who relied on the members of the supervisory and academic councils. In some universities, the right to elect professors belonged to the city authorities. As a rule, the most influential was the Faculty of Liberal Arts, since the largest number of students studied there, and accordingly, it had the largest teaching staff. Usually rectors came from this faculty. It can be said that any university in the Middle Ages was truly a state within a state, with its own laws, an independent court, and its own hierarchy. Even the currency was different. While only state money was used outside the university campus, inside you could see coins from many different countries, from rubles and reals to thalers and livres. Who studied at medieval universities? In theory, anyone could study at a medieval university. There were no class restrictions. The only limitation was financial, since all education at that time was paid. I'll talk more about the cost of education later, but I should note right away that the price of a university diploma in the Middle Ages was not exorbitant. A well-off peasant or craftsman could quite well send his child to get an education. Moreover, it was from the middle class that the majority came. If we talk about the ratio of different social groups, it was as follows. About 61% of the students came from peasant backgrounds. Around 18% were sons of townspeople and craftsmen. 8.4% came from small landowning nobility, 2% from the clergy, and only 0.6% from aristocrats. Yes, aristocrats were not particularly eager to attend universities, considering a military or at most a church career instead. The age of students also varied widely. For example, the Faculty of Liberal Arts accepted students as young as 14, but some scholars began their studies at an even younger age. For example, the famous jurist and father of international law, Hugo Grotius, entered Leiden University at the age of 11. One of the relatives of the Duke of Mantua studied in Bologna from the age of 10. On the other hand, no one was surprised if a person decided to get an education at a mature age. For example, the famous Ignacio Loyola, founder of the Jesuit order, began his studies at the age of 35, and the great philosopher Erasmus of Rotterdam finished his education after the age of 40. So, in medieval classrooms, both snot-nosed youngsters and gray-haired men hardened by life sat at the same desks. It is often written that higher education was closed to women in the Middle Ages, but this is a controversial issue. For example, in the same University of Bologna, the first female students appeared as early as the 12th century. Moreover, Dota de Accorso and Dorothea Bucca also taught there. The latter lady led the medical faculty of Bologna for more than 40 years. Although these were rather exceptions to the rule, most students were still men, as was taught in medieval universities. Now, about studying in general, the schedule resembled the modern academic year, divided into 2 semesters, and classes were held daily from morning until late in the evening. In some universities, they started at 5 a.m. Books were extremely rare at that time, so there was no question of having textbooks. The most valuable books were chained to shelves or the lectern. For example, in the 15th century, the medical faculty of the University of Paris had only 12 books. The main form of teaching was lecturing, and students did not take notes. They simply memorized what the teacher was saying. It's no surprise that a good memory was considered the main virtue of a medieval scholar. During classes, students were supposed to sit on the floor to humble their own pride and elevate the teacher. Lectures were divided into ordinary, important, mandatory, and veterinary, which were additional. The first ones were given in the morning, when students' minds worked better, and the second ones after lunch and on holidays. For being late or missing classes, a fine was imposed not only on the negligent student, but also on the irresponsible teacher. If a student missed 2 weeks of classes without a valid reason, they could be barred from taking the exam. By the way, students were not only fined but also flogged, most often with rods or a whip. Corporal punishment was most common in English and French universities. Overall, much depended on the authority of the lecturer. Good orators not only attracted full audiences, they became local celebrities whom students literally revered. The most charismatic ones gathered so many followers that they founded new universities in other cities. But if a teacher was lazy, students could easily disrupt his lecture. Students' favorite entertainment was debates. Formally, they were considered part of the educational process, but in reality, debates were something like a sport, extremely exciting and interesting. Debates were held on a wide variety of topics. People placed bets on the winners, there were entire debate leagues, and famous debate masters had their own teams of fans. The arguments were heated, and often when eloquence ran out, fists, clubs, or even swords would come into play. One of the main problems of medieval universities was that they trained only theorists. Despite the efforts of individual scholars, universities did not provide real knowledge about the structure of the world. The subordination of all sciences to theology held back scientific progress for centuries. The history course was a collection of legends or a dry list of names and dates. Medicine and anatomy were taught without demonstrations or laboratory experiments. What more can I say? The first teaching skeleton appeared at Heidelberg University only in 1559. Now imagine the level of doctors who graduated from this institution. How much did higher education cost in the Middle Ages? I've discussed education accessibility in the Middle Ages. Now I'll share some examples. In Portugal, at the University of Coimbra, at the Faculty of Law, wealthy students paid 40 livres for a year-long course of lectures. Students of average means paid 20 livres, and poor students only 10. Similar rates were set in a royal decree by João da Forge. For reference, 10 livres equaled 9 grams of silver, and the daily wage of a skilled worker in that era was about 5 to 6 livres. The payment was made twice a year, in summer and winter. Its amount also depended on the student's wealth and ranged from 2 to 10.5 livres. Those who were truly destitute could be exempted from payment altogether. Again, for comparison, a pair of shoes in those years cost 2 livres, a chicken 0.5 livre, and a sheep 4 livres. Apprentices earned 6 to 8 livres a week, while an experienced worker could earn up to 15. Obviously, money was needed not only for studying. A student had to live somewhere, eat every day, and have something to wear. But even here, everything was not too expensive. In Oxford, at the beginning of the 15th century, a student could live on 1.5 pence a day. That was very little money. A laborer at a construction site earned 3 to 4 pence a day, and a roofer earned 4.5. The English philologist Robert Whittington, who studied at Oxford at the end of the 15th century, recalled that during his student years he lived quite well on 7 pence a week. Despite the apparent cheapness, young people were always short of money. Most of the surviving letters from medieval students to their families contain requests for financial assistance. Resourceful students came up with all sorts of things to melt the hearts of their strict parents. Some painted frightening pictures of student life in their letters, others complained about the terrible cost of living due to poor harvests, and still others told scary stories about robbers who stole all their money. For example, one student from Bologna wrote that he was forced to beg, going from door to door through impassable mud. But even so, he rarely manages to bring anything home or have a proper meal. Medieval students had the opportunity to earn some money without even leaving the university walls. For example, students at Cambridge were paid for working in the university garden, and at Oxford, poor scholars helped build the new library building. You could always get a job as a servant for a wealthy student or a professor. Working in the dining hall or as a cleaner in the dormitory reduced the cost of living. But the most prestigious and highest paying job available to students was working as a scribe, which was in great demand during the Middle Ages. How did medieval students live? Most students, as well as many professors, lived in dormitories, which were called colleges in England, and in Germany and Austria were known as bursas or uxus. Medieval dormitories were not comfortable. Often students had to live in terrible conditions. For example, the famous Razum Rotterdam describes his college like this: "The rooms and dormitories are unhealthy, the walls are icy, there is only one restroom, and it reeks of stench. Anyone who stays long in this vinegar college will inevitably get sick and die." The alternative to the dormitory was a rented apartment, but not everyone could afford it. Student associations played a crucial role in the life of a medieval student. These associations included not only scholars but also teachers. They were hostile to each other, and often it came to fights, stabbings, and intervention by the city guard. Medieval universities were notorious for severe hazing, the likes of which you couldn't even imagine. In the Soviet army, young students were constantly subjected to humiliation and abuse by their senior comrades. For example, there was an initiation ritual that every student had to go through. It varied from university to university, but in general, the newcomer was subjected to humiliating and cruel procedures. They were forced to drink from a latrine, beaten, slapped, and asked riddles that had no answer. For instance, in Montpellier, the greenhorn had to perform a deadly jump from a height. In other universities, as part of the initiation, a student could be thrown out into the cold without clothes or dumped upside down. However, even after the initiation, life for young students did not become any easier. They had to serve the senior students, clean their clothes and shoes, tidy up, wait on them at the table, and run small errands. After reaching the status of grandfather, a student would start to bully the younger ones himself, and this tradition was preserved for literally centuries. Of course, there were also bright moments in the life of a medieval Schüler, which more than made up for all the hardships and deprivations of student life. I'll say more. After arriving in a big city and getting rid of parental control, young people partied in ways modern students couldn't even dream of. Drunkenness, gambling, and relationships with prostitutes were their favorite pastimes. The tavern was the true center of the universe for a medieval student. Here he drank, ate, slept, fought, and wrote academic papers. The scale of student drunkenness in that era is simply astonishing. In any city with a university, scholars consistently brought in the lion's share of profits for local taverns. Sometimes they even drank during classes. In the tavern, a student could not only drink with his friends, but also play gambling games with them. Cards, dice, balls, which were similar to modern bowling, and later billiards were very popular. Losing everything or even getting into debt was not just considered normal, but was even encouraged. It served as proof of a certain youthful bravado. Interestingly, the regulars at taverns were not only students, but also many university professors. Another passion of medieval scholars was romantic adventures with sex workers, and even the more frivolous women of that time were simply crazy about students. Usually, young maids were hired to work in taverns who, in addition to their main duties, also provided intimate services to the visitors. Other centers of debauchery were public baths, and of course, in any large medieval city, there was a completely legal red light district where scholars were regular visitors. It is said that the Pope was the personal patron of the prostitutes of Avignon, and their leader, who was jokingly called the abbess, was required to serve students for free. The topic of bad women who interfere with studies constantly comes up in letters from parents to their student sons. Of course, the scholars spent their leisure time not only with professional prostitutes, but also seduced young city girls. It was considered especially stylish to sleep with a professor's daughter. This was called commenting on the works of Cujas in honor of Professor Cujas's daughter, who supposedly couldn't refuse any student. Yes, students brought huge revenues to the city treasury, but often they turned the lives of the townspeople into a real nightmare. The students rioted, drank in the streets and sang loudly, harassed passers-by, started fights. In short, they misbehaved to the fullest, sometimes doing so with a lot of imagination. For example, one of the students' entertainments was called, to put it politely, Drop the Prostitute. The students ran around the city, trying to push as many prostitutes as possible into the mud. Another one of their amusements was stealing corpses from cemeteries. Sometimes it even escalated to outright crime. The students would form gangs, rob passers-by, and terrorize the local population. It was not uncommon for the students to anger the townspeople so much that they would organize real student riots. For example, in 1223, the people of Paris killed or threw 320 students into the Seine, and centuries later, an enraged mob of socialists burned down 14 dormitories in Oxford, killing more than 20 students. Dozens of such cases can be recalled, but they led absolutely nowhere. Time would pass, passions would subside, and the restless scholars would return to their riotous lives. The higher educational institutions tried to keep their students in check, but they were frankly bad at it. Instead of an afterword, universities are a fascinating phenomenon of medieval Europe, and their importance is hard to overestimate. The emergence of educational institutions founded on democratic principles, with common teaching rules and an in-depth study of the ancient heritage, became a turning point in the development of European science and education. Despite all their shortcomings, these were true intellectual centers of Europe. It was here that the changes began, which would eventually lead to a true spiritual revolution and the beginning of the Renaissance. Well, that's all from me. See you in the next episode. Bye.